My name's Ewan Upstead. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Museum of Contemporary Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here in our brand new theatre. I will just give you a couple of stats though. One is we've been open 2 months and we've had 264,000 visitors through the museum, through the galleries only. That's not events and all that sort of stuff which are going ballistic. So it's an outstanding success story. The other thing is, the one thing that is finished, which Nexus is responsible, is all the IT infrastructure. And to their credit, they rolled it out in a dusty building site. We didn't have 1 day of downtime, and it is functioning invisibly, which is the best thing you want with IT infrastructure. So that's a plug for Nexus, and on the mention of Nexus, I'd like to introduce John Dobbin. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ewan. So good morning and welcome again. So the objective of today's exercise is for us to transfer as much knowledge as possible in 1 hour about desktop virtualization. At the internal discussions that we have at Nexus, we often ask our engineers and our consultants, guys, what are the technologies and the solutions that are delivering the most value to our customers? And a few years ago, it was all about private cloud, virtualization, unified storage. But increasingly today, the answer is always desktop virtualization, desktop virtualization. It's the only way to go. The only way to have a desktop is to virtualize it. So that's myself, John Dobbin. Andrew Dent, when we find him, he's an internet entrepreneur. He's had 2 successful startups, and he's returned to Australia to work with Citrix. Now, we've chosen Andrew because he's not the archetypal salesman. He's more of a technologist. He's more of a solution-focused person. We didn't want to bombard our customers with marketing hype. We wanted to get down to the real nitty-gritty. After that, Sean's going to introduce our case study, because it's all very well to talk about theory and to talk about bits and bytes and to talk about different technologies, but it doesn't really work. So we're going to have a real-life case study, and Jacob's going to take us through a couple of things. He's going to take us through his journey, his evolution of how the YHA, which was a very challenging organisation to muster in its IT because of a whole bunch of constraints which they'll talk about. But not only did he have to harness in the technology and deliver a solution, but he had to sell it internally. And one of the things that we're most impressed with was the way that Jacob created the presentations that enabled him to sell a fairly technical concept to non-technical people.
I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about desktop virtualization. Quick presentation, around half an hour. Obviously there's a lot of excitement on desktop virtualization in the market. So in this presentation, really try and cover 3 things. We'll look at, what are some of the major drivers for desktop virtualization in the market today. And then we'll spend a little bit of time looking at some of the components of desktop virtualization, what it is, what are the major factors to think about. And then finally, I'd like to give you some thoughts on just some of the things that we've found in our experiences as we've been through this desktop virtualization journey. So let's jump into it then. So at Citrix, we really believe that from a computing perspective, we're in a major transitional period right now. We're moving from this PC era to the cloud era. And it's changing a lot of things, particularly the role of IT within the organisation. I think, firstly, we used to build our own infrastructures. We manage them ourselves. And very, very quickly, that's moving now to IT being a sourcer of products, and then a service delivery organisation. So we see a lot of upheaval in the way IT is trying to reposition themselves in this new world. If we think about the user perspective, in the PC era, the use case was fairly well set. I would have employees drive into the office. They would typically work on a Windows-based machine. If that machine was hardwired into the network, it would typically work on a suite of applications, whether it be personal productivity or enterprise software applications, that were put on on-prem equipment and delivered over the networks of the corporation. Now, we always had these corner case use cases with the road warriors, the sales folks out in the field. But quickly, that use case now is coming to the fore. Most workers today increasingly are becoming mobile. They're bringing their own devices into the enterprise, and they're connecting not over our networks but over public networks, and they're not necessarily using our applications anymore. They're using applications from third parties. And so when we think about this at Citrix, we really think that the exceptions of the PC era are now the rule. And so this has really changed everything. This new work style, this wave of consumerization that's coming into the enterprise, these Gen Ys that are bringing in these new devices, have changed that work style, and that in turn has meant we're going to have to find new computing models that are going to be able to support this. And we think that that's ultimately going to lead to changes in the way we do business. So really a disruptive era that we're in. So if I can give you some examples of how this is manifesting itself, this was probably 10 years ago. This was my life. I would certain chunk where I would go to work and then I would go home, and that was separate. Obviously, many of us had RAS and we could connect in remotely. But now my new work style, for good or bad, is I'm kind of always on. I wish that green period was probably a little, it was realistic, but I work with Fort Lauderdale and around the globe, so there's probably a lot more blue in there for me. But I think many of you can kind of relate to this picture of these slices of life where our home life is intruding into the office and our office life is intruding into the home. And so when we think about this new way of working, what we need is a compute environment which is really going to help us seamlessly make these transitions in our lives, where I can be working in an office context, I can quickly switch to a personal context, and the security of my data goes with me. The context of my conversations go with me. So at Citrix, we really talk about this as trying to make a seamless environment for our users. What we found is that the desktop model has served us very well for many years, but increasingly that model is now coming under pressure, and both from the IT perspective and the user's perspective. I think the user perspective is primarily the most important one, in that people just need to get their apps, their data, and their desktops wherever they are, whether it's iPad, the mobile phone. And if IT doesn't give it to them, they'll find a way to work around to get that. They'll use services like Dropbox to get their data. And obviously the user experience is another component as well. We look at a lot of the traditional desktop and SAP style applications. Consumers are now used to a much more user-friendly, task-orientated applications. So the sheer, the user experience and the flexibility is really not working for the users, and IT is extremely challenged as well. I mean, we've got, many of you are probably on XP today, moving to Windows 7, moving to Windows 8. We seem to be in this constant upgrade cycle, refresh cycle on the clients. It's very expensive, and then change is very difficult to manage. I've got hundreds of different devices out there in the field. I've got my Androids, I've got my iOS devices, I've got my thin clients, and then trying to manage the change, the security patches on many of these applications in a distributed model has become very challenging. I think this is where desktop virtualization starts to come into the picture. If we think about what would be really an ideal world here, we'd really like users to be able to access their desktops, their data from anywhere. Any user should be able to do that. The user experience is key. I think maybe some of you have tried to push a desktop onto an iPad. I think that's sort of an interesting use case for some executives. It's usable to some extent, but it's not really a great user experience. So what we really need is a native, great user experience for all of our application on all of these devices. So that's really the user piece. And then the IT piece, we really need a great way to centrally manage all this stuff, and that needs to enforce all our security policies. Some of you may be working in banking environments or with credit card data where you need to do PCI or APCRA style regulatory stuff. And then obviously, maybe not so relevant for this audience, but I was up in Brisbane recently, and I think the word on everybody's lips up there is really business continuity when you're thinking about floods and natural disasters. So this is really an idealized world of what I'd like to have. And so desktop virtualization has really come in to and is a solution to many of these problems. I think if we'd had this conversation maybe even last year or the year before, I would say that many people are still kicking the tires on desktop virtualization. We found that there was some technology components that really weren't quite there, which would lend themselves to the technology going prime time. And there was also quite a significant cost issue associated with desktop virtualization. The technology was still relatively new, and feature-wise and cost, it just really couldn't cross the bar of a fully managed desktop environment. But increasingly, I think those problems have gone away. This year, I can tell you we're seeing just, especially in the ANZ region, we're just seeing massive interest in desktop virtualization. And some of the proof points there are really moving from really small pilots to, I think it's sort of public knowledge that we just sold over a 100,000 seat deal to the Department of Defence. So we're sort of starting to get to these really large-scale, mission-critical, enterprise-wide deployments rolling out in mass. And I think there's that technology maturity piece, but there's also this wave of consumerization, which is just, it is not stopping. That's something that's here to stay, and people are really needing to address that issue. So just some data points. I think the research is there. So my message today, really in this piece, is that desktop virtualization is really on fire, and we're seeing that. I think it's a good time to be thinking about it. Now, when I first started at Citrix, I sort of got a little bit confused about what was being virtualized in the app, and it can get kind of confusing sometimes. Basically today what I have is I've got all my apps and my data, my desktops are all running locally in what we call sort of a managed environment. And so in desktop virtualization, what I do is I pick up all those software assets and then I basically run them in the data center, right? So all the compute power is now in the data center. And then what I do is I use a technology, and we'll go into some of the details, to push that out. So the application and everything's pretty much running in the data center, and then I just basically screen push that out to the different devices. So what that enables me to do is to do neat things like one user, all their profiles in the data center, and that profile can then follow them around. So that's, the really basics of desktop virtualization. And then from a benefits perspective, we've already talked about this a little bit, but on the user experience front, it gives me that ability to, it frees up the user from the desk. So obviously I've got this ability now to push this functionality that I've stored centrally out to many devices. So a user can now have many devices, and their preferences, the data, the applications can more seamlessly follow them around because I'm storing that asset centrally in the data center. And this is good from an IT perspective as well, because now I've got everything centrally, and it's easier for me to manage. Let's now do one click down from the dinner party conversation. Okay, I'm interested. Tell me a little bit more about this technology. So we'll go a little more technical now. But when I think about desktop virtualization, I think a little bit about a supply chain where you've got the raw material, and moving forward to consumption. So on the raw material side, think about, and Xen Desktop is our virtualization product. Essentially, you've got the user profile, you've got the apps, the data, and the operating system. Think about those as your raw materials, what I need to create my finished good. And then on the end side, you've got the consumer, which is essentially your end user. And our technology on the consumption side is a thing called Citrix receiver. Think about that as just a browser for any of your applications and your data. And so what I need to do is when a user requests some sort of capability from the data center, I need to assemble that, pack it into the box, and then I need to ship it out. So there's two key technologies and these are both Citrix brand names, so it does get a little confusing sometimes, but you have FlexCast. Think about that as how I assemble the user profile, the operating system, and I'm doing this on the fly. And then I just pump it out over this thing called HDX, which is essentially the FedEx over the internet and whatnot. So let's look at this FlexCast technology, and it'll become clear why this is important in a minute. And I'll give you a heads up. It's basically a cost driver, because when you think about all of your different employees in the organization, you've typically got 4, 5, maybe 6 different classes of employees, and each of these employees have different, use cases or different computing needs. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I don't have, all my people don't sit at the desktop, and then I've got my designers over here that these people need Macs and they need high-end graphics, but the salespeople, they all want Blackberries and whatnot. So the point being is there's not one use case, and this was one of the reasons why the costs in desktop virtualization were really expensive early up, because everyone had sort of figured out this office worker, the PC one, but these other use cases for the remote workers and the guest workers were not completely figured out. So if we think about the different ways of assembling for this FlexCast technology, there's a couple of different ways. And this is my only really technical slide in the presentation. But essentially, the first way is up here. We have what's called a hosted shared desktop. Now, essentially what that is you're running one copy of the operating system in the data center, and that copy of Windows is servicing many, many users. And that's sort of the traditional way that that virtualization was implemented. It's a technology formerly called terminal services at Microsoft. And that's very good because it has a very high density. It enables you to support a lot of users at a low cost. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't provide a lot of flexibility and power for those power users that need the graphics and that need the laptops and all that. So the second model is really what we call VDI. You'll hear this word VDI a lot. And essentially what that does is it creates a separate operating system for a separate copy of Windows for each user. So what that's great for then is that the user can have their own desktop. They've got the personalized settings. You can customize that a lot more. And then you can take that to an extreme where you might have super power users that say, I need dedicated graphics processing on my machine. So you can allocate those users specific processing in the data center, one per blade type model. So those are sort of 3 different options you have for delivering to the different users. There's another set of use cases as well, so without trying to go into too much detail, but these use cases work better more for what we call the offline use case. So I have a thing called a local stream desktop, and what that does is it basically lets the computer boot remotely, and it will load the operating system so the operating system will run locally on that machine. You can run the operating system locally on the machine and then virtualize the application down to run on that desktop. So you sort of got this hybrid model, and then you've got a technology called Xen Client, which is basically desktops to go. An end user synchronizes with the VDI environment, they get a desktop, and then they can take that away and work offline. So this FlexCast technology, really what it does, it assembles using one of these 6 different methods and delivers the application to the user. Traditionally, in the past years, a typical VDI installation would be 30% more expensive. And so obviously the market there is really just pushing at people who are looking at some sort of quantum leap in terms of functionality, and it won't address sort of the cost end of the market. So a lot of business cases aren't going to stand up from that perspective. But using this FlexCast technology, where I have these different options, I can support the remote users, I can support the users with the single processor. We've been able to get Xen Desktop FlexCast down to 15% less than a physical desktop. So the economics are starting to push in favour of desktop virtualization. And I think we have a white paper, which is, because all numbers are open to dispute, right? But I think we've got some white papers. But I think generally the market has accepted that VDI now, desktop virtualization is cheaper to do than the physical desktops. And then just one last slide. I think that this was something that we announced at our show recently in San Francisco, where we've been able to further compress the cost here. And this is owing to advances that we've made in our thin client technology, where we've got basically the endpoint cost down to less than $100. So you see the blue bar in device really getting compressed there. So this has been a big market driver for us. So I think clearly, by all metrics, we're the number one in desktop virtualization. So let's move now from that back end to the consumption piece. So receivers, the technology, think about it as your app data browser. And so obviously we have a fairly extensive platform support. So we talked about the assembly piece. The last piece is the sort of the delivery man. The FedEx, so to speak, that takes the package from the data center to the end client. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but that's basically a technology called HTX. And so sort of some of the issues that you need to think about with respect to this delivery technology is video is just prevalent in our lives, and more will be built into enterprise applications. So if you're delivering an application from the data center and it's like a really high-end graphics application, sometimes it can be not efficient to run that application in the data center. It can be more efficient to just pump the data down to the end device and then use the graphical capabilities of that device on the endpoint. So that's technology that HDX takes care for. It's sort of smart. It says, oh, I'm running a highly intensive graphics application. The server said he's going to wipe out every user's performance if he tries to run this CAD application. Let's run it locally on the client. And then the user there will have a big CAD workstation and they'll get that local performance whilst they'll have the data in the application on the server. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about the delivery technologies. By and large, when I go out and see people implementing desktop virtualization, they've probably done one of two things. They've sort of repurposed some other gear they've got to try and cobble this stuff together. So they haven't, you've got to look at the whole stack really, at the storage and the compute. You've got to think about it holistically. And the second thing that they do wrong is they get something working for 50 users and I sort of get the call, it's like, oh, it's running a bit slow, and it's like you go out there and they've got 400 or 500 users on the thing, right? So it's sort of, this is a great thing, everyone's using it. So I think the bottom line is you probably just don't really try and jump into it and think you know it all based on this presentation, I think, and that's why we've got our friends Nexus here who's sort of experts on that sort of stuff. But it's like anything, like a remodel. You'll get what you put in on the planning on the front end.
Jacob Johnson from YHA has been the IT manager there for 4 years, and I think we've been looking after those guys for getting on 10 years now. John nailed it in his preliminary intro. I think the thing that Jacob's done that is what an IT leader is meant to do is not only have a vision of what's meant to happen next, but to communicate it to the management and get their buy-in. And that's been a very cool thing. And I think the proof in the pudding for what Jacob's achieved at YHA is very simple, because when we started looking after it, we were looking after YHA New South Wales only. And they have achieved such a good IT outcome that's been wholesale adopted by their organisation nationally. And you can't do better than that, really. So, Jacob.
We are part of YHA Hosteling International. There are about 4,000 hostels in 62 countries. We have over 100 hostels in Australia, and we record almost 1.5 million overnights annually in Australia, which many of the hotel five-star industry would be hoping to achieve. It's not and most of our operations are 24/7, so it's important that we have systems running 365 days a year. As you can see, you got a lot of sites across the country, and YHA till about 2007 worked as a separate entity in every state and territory. So they had separate IT infrastructure. They worked separately in operations. The HR policies, financial controls were all separate to every region. So you can imagine the efficiency was not the best. We wanted to get to the next stage where we could provide a better service, not just for the business, but also for the travelers. I want to take you through a journey. This is something I showed to the management team a few years back. When I started working for YHA in 2007, we had an office at Kent Street, and YHA Limited at the time was called YHA New South Wales. YHA New South Wales supported or managed hostels in ACT, Northern Territory, and New South Wales, and all of them were quite separate in itself. If you can look at the picture, you'll find they had their own internet service, they had hardware at the hostels, they were all very decentralized. It was not, and imagine IT guys sitting at the Kent Street office and trying to manage that environment. It was quite difficult. What we did in early 2008 was we went to the next stage of actually connecting all the sites back and at least getting to a stage where they were all joined to one domain, and we could at least manage the sites, at least have a connectivity back to them and support them from our office in Kent Street. But still, I'm not going to read through all that, but there were a lot of drawbacks with this setup. Just the first point is just an application we have in-house. So if you can see some of the points we wanted to come over was the backup was quite difficult. Managing servers across all the sites were quite difficult. Nexus was part of the team when managing all these servers. They used to get a lot of calls in the night, it was not an easy process. So we wanted what did we want to achieve? For me, this gave me an opportunity to bring everything in-house to one location. I wanted to make my life and my IT staff team's life much easier. We wanted to get the hardware back in a central location so that we can manage the edge endpoints better. So what we did a proof of concept with 2 sites. If you can see, we moved the hardware from 2 sites. One was in Glebe, that's in the city, and one was in Byron Bay, quite remote to our office in Kent Street. We tried this experiment of proof of concept in late 2008. What we did was we partnered up with Citrix. I guess this was quite early days for the VDI infrastructure. We had a lot of issues. We had a few issues at that time, mainly around Flash, high graphic websites. It was not easy for the users to access that environment. But we kept going with this. We just, from a user perspective, all our applications worked fine, but for these high graphic applications. And so what we did after 2008 was when we started connecting all the sites across to the Kent Street office, we needed to move or take all the environment back to a data center because it was not, Kent Street office was not capable to manage this whole environment when the environment started growing larger. So we moved to a data center, and our first site, Sydney Harbour, which is just across MCA here, we opened that hostel in late 2009, and that was one of the successful projects where we built the whole hostel from an IT infrastructure in a data center. And when the hostel started in December of 2009, we were able to push the whole IT infrastructure to the site within 4 hours because we already had built the infrastructure in the data center. We tested all the systems. For example, it's quite important to have the doors opening when a guest walks in. So we even tested the doors at the data center. We didn't have to have physical we didn't have to have physical presence in the building. So we tested everything at the data center. We were asked to move in. We were allowed to walk into the office at 7 in the morning. By around 10, we told the operation manager that you can start checking in guests, which was very different to how the company did it in the past. They needed 4 to 5 days to set up the infrastructure in the past. This was a success story with Sydney Harbour, and then the business started acquiring, or the various entities started joining together. YHA Ltd then started supporting YHA in Queensland and YHA in Victoria. YHA in Queensland came across to YHA Limited in 2010, and in 1 year we have moved. We were able to get YHA in Queensland across to the environment too. What I'm trying to show here is somebody in this room asked about bandwidth. Most of our sites are quite varied in size. We have from 50 beds in one hostel to some of them have over 400 beds in a hostel. What that means is some hostels have 2 computers, some hostels have 30 computers. It's very different, the whole structure. So we had various bandwidth links to the hostels, and some of the hostels have from 2 meg, and some of the hostels have 512. And all were business grade managed services from the data center. How did we manage the bandwidth? Like Andrew mentioned, we started putting in branch repeaters, or it's called, we put branch repeaters on all the sites. A 512 meg pretty much gave us performance of close to 512 kV link almost gave us bandwidth to almost 1 meg. So it kind of doubled the performance. What I'm trying to show in this picture is when Queensland came on to the YHA Limited environment, we were in a position to get 6 to 7 sites across onto the network within months. We didn't have to do any major changes at the data center or at the remote sites because we were just taking everything away from them. They didn't have any desktops, there's no servers there, and we still have, in 2008 there were about 3 IT staff in the company. We still have 3 IT staff now managing close to 26 sites, and that's growing to another 50 more in the next few months actually, because everything is now in one basket. Everything's sitting in Macquarie Telecom. What if the whole place falls apart? Then we have the whole environment down. So I guess our next step where YHA is heading is for a shared service environment where we're trying to actually set up a separate data center. It can be, it could be next door, but this is the whole plan. This is our vision for 2012, starting in 2012 and 2013. We want to set a separate data center and have sites across the whole country get into the VDI environment. So for us, this has, VDI environment has worked quite well. The SDX technology, which Andrew mentions, has solved our problems we had with Flash. we used to have an issue with the high with high PDF files, with large files. We had issues with printing with them. It used to be quite slow. But what we did was we used a solution called Thin Print. Thin Print helped solve that problem. So now we don't have any issues with printing. And for the edge devices, we're using a product called YHA Ltd. One thing what we learned from this whole process, we wanted to make life easier for IT, user experiences improved, and we chose solutions like Citrix. We chose a thin client called YHA Ltd, and we used Thin Print to make the whole solution work. So today YHA can support over 100 sites, and that's where we see ourselves in the future.
All right, so
Hands up.
anyone want to be game and ask a question? I know it's early.
The lady in the red.
Andrew, how does Citrix deal with application compatibility with, if I'm a business and I'm running a whole lot of different applications? I know there are some of my clients in the room that have this situation, and those applications are legacy applications, i.e. I'm not going to support Windows 7, but they are business critical applications.
Yeah,
How does Citrix help with that?
Yeah, I think that's something that we've traditionally been very good at, is supporting these legacy applications. Actually, we have a lot of customers that are on extremely old versions of they come to us and they're like, we're on Citrix 4.0, which is something we built back in the 80s basically, and I call Citrix formaldehyde. Sometimes you put your apps in there and they just seem to run forever. But at some point in life, we all need to go through the upgrade and the pain of that. And so one of the things that we see is that, and no disrespect to the integrators, but there's sort of one line and with a lot of zeros on it, and it's like, we'll move all your applications over. And that cost is extremely high because people just don't know, what they're going to run. We might tear up the floorboards and find there's dry. We just don't know until we get in there. So we bought a company last year. It's a company called AppDNA. And basically, and I was sort of surprised when I first looked at it. I thought, oh, well, this is not extremely interesting. But it's actually very exciting because what it does is it's sort of an analyzer tool, and it's just a one-time shot deal that you use, but you point it at all your apps, and it sort of gives you a bill of material. So you say, I want to go from XP to Windows 7, and I'm going from managed to virtualized, and it gives you this whole scorecard of which, it goes in and looks at all the technical pieces and said, well, this one will go over fine, and this one, you're you're going to need to rewrite it, and this one. So that AppDNA tool is kind of a useful tool to use as you're going through this migration piece. So.